In a world ruled by polarized feeds and optimization dashboards, one 19th century thinker mapped the cultural forces tearing modern life in two. In 1872, while a young professor at the University of Basel, Friedrich Nietzsche published The Birth of Tragedy, arguing that Greek art was powered by a dual engine whose conflict still shapes creativity, politics, and identity today. This was not nostalgia, it was diagnosis. Nietzsche's claim is revolutionary. He reframed art as the arena where life justifies itself and culture as a dynamic between competing drives. What gives art its power? Why does reason exhaust itself? Can passion be disciplined without being suffocated? How does a society avoid sterile order or chaotic frenzy? What renews meaning when old certainties collapse? What makes Nietzsche unique is his insistence that greatness emerges not from harmony as tranquility, but from a disciplined tension between opposing energies. What follows is a comprehensive map of his core ideas, from the Apollonian and Dionysian to the Übermensch and eternal recurrence. Welcome to SleepyPhilosopher, a space for absorbing profound ideas at a pace that allows genuine understanding. If this resonates, consider subscribing and share where you are listening from. Let the journey begin with the dichotomy that launched Nietzsche's project. The Apollonian and Dionysian dichotomy stands as Nietzsche's foundational insight into how human creativity and culture are generated and sustained. Developed through his philological study of Greek tragedy and sharpened by personal encounters with illness, music, and intellectual solitude, the distinction names two primary currents of psychic and cultural life. The Apollonian symbolizes clarity, proportion, and restraint. The Dionysian names rapture, dissolution of boundaries, and primordial vitality. Nietzsche argued that civilization, at its highest, is not the triumph of one over the other, but a dynamic equipoise that makes existence bearable and even beautiful. This is the ground on which his later philosophy is built. The Apollonian designates the domain of form, lucid images, measured order, intelligible structure, and what Nietzsche, following Schopenhauer, calls the principle of individuation, the sense of distinct selfhood that stabilizes experience. The Dionysian, by contrast, is intoxication, the surge of affect in which individuality loosens, suffering and joy interpenetrate, and one feels part of a larger, unbounded life. Nietzsche's reasoning is structural. Dreams model the Apollonian power to render images that make chaos intelligible, while ecstasy models the Dionysian force that overwhelms separateness. Greek tragedy fuses them, the sculpted dialogue and plot Apollonian, articulating and containing the choral song and musical depth Dionysian. For Nietzsche, art is life's justification because it stages this productive antagonism rather than denying it. Operationally, this dichotomy works through alternation and integration. Dionysian surges generate raw material, energy, insight, daring connections, while Apollonian discipline selects, shapes, and renders them communicable. In practice, cycles of expansion and consolidation appear. An inventor brainstorms freely, then refines a single viable design. A composer improvises motifs, then scores precise orchestration. A statesperson absorbs conflicting impulses across a population, then crafts a law tempered by limits. When one pole dominates, pathology appears. Pure Apollonian control yields sterile classicism and risk aversion. Pure Dionysian release yields volatility and burnout. Health arises when intensity is translated into form without extinguishing its originating force. Contemporarily, the model illuminates creative work, personal development, and organizational design. In software teams, hackathon-style exploration, Dionysian, is fruitful only when followed by code reviews, testing, and documentation, Apollonian. In scientific labs, imaginative hypothesis generation requires protocol rigor to avoid false discovery. In personal life, scheduling deep work and sleep supports periods of spirited spontaneity, travel, art-making, unstructured play, without letting either calcify into habit or dissolve into chaos. Even politics displays the pattern. Reform movements energize institutions, but institutions must codify gains without neutralizing their originating vitality. The dichotomy explains why balanced alternation, sprint and edit, risk and review, outperforms one-mode cultures. Integratively, the Apollonian Dionysian framework prefigures later Nietzschean themes. It anticipates the will to power as the interplay of form-giving and intensification. It prepares the critique of moralism as a life-denying fixation on order, and it foreshadows the transvaluation of values, where affirmation requires saying yes to both suffering and exuberance. Understanding this balance clarifies how meaning can persist after inherited certainties weaken. Creation replaces consolation. The path forward in Nietzsche's system proceeds from this aesthetic foundation toward a revaluation of truth, morality, and selfhood, tasks that will unfold in the next segments. Nietzsche's will to power is the keystone of his mature philosophy, a lens for rereading motives, institutions, and epochs as expressions of graded strength, creative assertion, and the drive to shape forms. Developed across Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883-1885, Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, and On the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, and echoed in notebooks later compiled posthumously, the idea moves beyond survival to explain expansion, rank, and style in life. It reinterprets cultural achievement and decline as outcomes of how energies are organized and elevated. The early Apollonian Dionysian contrast supplied the anatomy of forces that the will to power later gathers into a unifying dynamic. It sets the stakes for understanding ambition, culture, and conscience. At the theoretical level, the will to power names life's fundamental tendency to appropriate, strengthen, and order. Not a crude appetite for domination, but a drive to expand capacity, confer form, and legislate meaning. Nietzsche portrays the psyche as a plural field of drives that seek rank. What appears as a single self is a provisional hierarchy established by the prevailing drive. Value creation, or the setting of standards for what counts as good, is an expression of this drive, as is interpretation, perspectival ordering of a world so that action becomes possible. He resists teleology. There is no final goal outside the play of increasing strength. Power here measures growth in flourishing, not mere possession of resources. Operationally, the will to power works through selection, sublimation, and internalization. Drives compete. Those with greater integrative force organize others into a coherent regimen, which is experienced as ambition, curiosity, or rigor. Sublimation channels volatile impulses into durable achievements. Discipline translates intensity into form. Internalization, especially under moral strictures, turns outward aggression inward, producing bad conscience. This is a reactive configuration that can both damage and refine, depending on how it is governed. Consider an elite athlete who converts injury into a redesigned training technique, a chef who shapes a regional cuisine by reworking inherited recipes, or a mathematician who invents a proof strategy that reorders an entire subfield. In each case, raw energy becomes articulated power. In contemporary life, the will to power clarifies both personal development and institutional transformation. Deliberate practice, skill stacking, and the choice of demanding standards illustrate self-overcoming, the selective elevation of capacities by accepting constraints that concentrate force. A school principal who replaces superficial grading with portfolio assessment, a hospital that redesigns triage to increase real patient outcomes rather than throughput, or a cooperative marketplace that rewards long-term contribution rather than short-term extraction, each exemplify form-giving power. The concept also cautions against mistaking domination or vanity metrics for strength. Genuine power increases the ability to create, coordinate, and endure. It measures success by heightened capability and durability, not by momentary visibility. Grasping the will to power integrates earlier themes and prepares forthcoming ones. It shows how the Apollonian impulse to shape and the Dionysian impulse to overflow are ranked and harnessed in higher unities. It illuminates the genealogy of moralities as different configurations of active and reactive power, foreshadows the crisis named by the death of God as a vacuum for value creation, and frames the Übermensch as intensified self-overcoming. The eternal recurrence then appears as a test of strength, whether a life could affirm its pattern endlessly. Understanding this principle clarifies how values are made, sustained, and transfigured. Nietzsche's pronouncement that God is dead marks his most disruptive diagnosis of modern European culture. The highest source of value and meaning has lost its binding force. Announced memorably by the madman in The Gay Science, 1882, the claim names a historical event rather than a theological refutation. The waning authority of transcendence under scientific critique, historical consciousness, and moral scrutiny. The stakes are existential. With the old moral horizon dimmed, a vacuum opens that he calls nihilism, the suspicion that life lacks inherent purpose or order. This crisis connects the psychic dynamics previously explored, Apollonian form and Dionysian energy, to a civilizational challenge requiring deliberate value creation. It is the turning point of modernity, not its conclusion. The theoretical framework is precise. God is dead signals the collapse of absolute guarantors, metaphysical truths, divine commands, timeless moral certainties through which earlier ages grounded value. Nihilism designates the devaluation of the highest values, where inherited ends appear arbitrary, unpersuasive, or hypocritical. Nietzsche distinguished passive nihilism, which drifts toward weary resignation and the figure of the last man, from active nihilism, which clears space by dismantling false idols. Values in his account are rank-orderings of drives stabilized by practices and institutions. Truth, morality, and purpose no longer appeal to a beyond, but must be justified by their effects on life. The claim thus relocates normativity from metaphysics to the conditions of flourishing. Operationally, the death of a transcendent center unfolds as a sequence. First, inherited norms persist as empty forms. Next, skepticism exposes their historical contingency. Then, rival substitutes compete to fill the void. This yields recognizable patterns, procedural compliance replacing substantive conviction, moralizing rhetoric masking ressentiment, and a preference for comfort over greatness. Institutional life exhibits shells of once sacred practices maintained for stability, while individuals oscillate between indecision and zealotry. Nietzsche's diagnostic hallmark is whether a value enhances power, creativity, and courage, or whether it anesthetizes striving. Active nihilism becomes a testing process, clearing exhausted meanings, experimenting with new hierarchies, and affirming those that intensify life rather than merely tranquilize it. the contemporary landscape reveals the thesis with clarity. Secularization has accelerated, yet functional surrogates proliferate. Civic mythologies, productivity cults, wellness spiritualities, and technocratic perfectionism claim absolute status without transcendence. In corporate governance, ethical language often contracts into risk-minimizing checklists, producing moral safety rather than moral aspiration. In public discourse, purity demands and punitive conformity mimic ascetic ideals in secular dress. Activism without sustaining purposes cycles between heroic intensity and burnout. Climate anxiety and technological utopianism alternately tempt paralysis and fanaticism. A Nietzschean response emphasizes experimental self-legislation, artistic and ethical style, and small communities of practice that refine demanding standards by results for vitality rather than by inherited authority. The criterion is practical. Does a value generate strength, depth, and generative work? Integratively, this crisis reframes earlier themes. The will to power becomes the engine of revaluation, while Apollonian discipline shapes Dionysian energies into durable forms of life. Confronting nihilism is not a detour but a precondition for transvaluation, the creation of new tables of value adequate to a godless world. The point is neither nostalgia nor cynicism. It is the maturation of responsibility at the level of culture and character. This sets the trajectory toward Nietzsche's constructive figures, the Übermensch and eternal recurrence, where affirmation becomes the ultimate test of any value one dares to create. Master-slave morality is one of Nietzsche's most incisive diagnostic tools, revealing that moral valuations arise from power relations rather than universal truths. Developed most explicitly in Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, and on the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, the analysis traces how dominant and subordinate groups create different ethical languages to secure their forms of life. The intellectual stakes are high. If morality is a historical product of competing forces, then moral certainty often conceals strategies of survival or rule. This reframes moral history as a struggle over value creation, preparing the ground for critiques of herd morality and the call for a transvaluation of values. Master morality names as good what expresses power, courage, generosity, and rank. It evaluates from the standpoint of self-affirmation, distinguishing the noble from the merely common as a difference of strength rather than guilt. Slave morality, by contrast, originates in ressentiment, chronic, powerless indignation that cannot discharge itself in action, and therefore inverts values through moral condemnation. It distinguishes good from evil, where evil focuses upon the traits of the strong, pride, assertiveness, grandeur, and good valorizes humility, patience, and compassion. Nietzsche's account includes a priestly mediation. Spiritual elites refine ressentiment into systematic ethical frameworks, universalizing reactive judgments and furnishing a metaphysics that justifies the inversion. This value inversion operates through identifiable mechanisms. First, redefinition. Terms like good migrate from denoting noble excellence to indicating harmlessness and obedience, while bad becomes morally loaded as evil. Second, interiorization. Drives that cannot act outwardly turn inward, generating guilt and what Nietzsche calls the bad conscience, a self-lacerating moral psychology that polices instinct. Third, institutional consolidation. Codes, penance, and communal surveillance normalize reactive virtues and stigmatize aristocratic self-assertion. The ascetic ideal completes the circuit by treating suffering as meaningful proof of moral worth, thereby domesticating vitality and channeling it into self-denial rather than creative expenditure. Contemporary moral conflicts often repeat these dynamics under secular banners. In debates about remote work regimes, for example, productivity is moralized as virtue or vice to discipline rival work styles, with slogans that elevate sacrifice or, conversely, stigmatize ambition as exploitation. Open-source software communities sometimes recast technical authority as moral gatekeeping, while others condemn low-effort participation as parasitic, revealing clashing value languages about contribution and rank. Dietary cultures that praise clean eating can convert bodily discipline into moral status, treating indulgence as defilement. Urban zoning disputes are framed as battles between greedy developers and obstructionist neighbors, where policy preferences acquire the weight of moral righteousness. Grasping master-slave morality clarifies how the will to power informs moral history and why the crisis of nihilism follows the collapse of inherited justifications. It does not license cruelty. Rather, it uncovers the genesis of moral claims so that value creation can become deliberate, life-enhancing, and future-oriented. This perspective connects directly to transvaluation. Only by recognizing reactive inversions can higher standards of excellence be articulated without disguise. It also reopens the Apollonian Dionysian tension at the level of ethics, suggesting that lucid form and vital force must be recomposed in new ideals, preparing the path toward later Nietzschean figures of self-overcoming. Nietzsche's Perspectivism marks a decisive reorientation of truth itself, contending that knowledge is inseparable from the vantage points of living beings who interpret, value, and select. Developed in response to the collapse of metaphysical certainties announced in the Critique of Nihilism, Perspectivism offers a disciplined alternative to dogma by treating interpretations as indispensable yet corrigible. It grows out of his analyses of valuation and the dynamics previously linked to morality and the will to power, insisting that outlooks are historically and physiologically conditioned. The stakes are high. Either cling to fictive absolutes or learn to compare and rank perspectives without pretending to a view from nowhere. This shift supplies a method rather than a creed. At the theoretical level, Perspectivism holds that all cognition is interpretation. Concepts, classifications, and judgments arise from situated drives, linguistic habits, and inherited standards of value. A perspective is not a private whim but a structured horizon, an organized pattern of selection and emphasis through which reality is grasped. There is no absolute disembodied standpoint. However, this does not entail trivial relativism. Nietzsche distinguishes stronger from weaker perspectives by their scope, coherence, resistance to counter-evidence, and capacity to incorporate rival insights. What has been called objectivity in this view is the disciplined multiplication and integration of vantage points, not a subtraction of standpoint. Truth becomes a regulative achievement, robust interpretations that prove fruitful across contexts. Operationally, perspectives form through the ordering of drives, the sedimentation of language, and the training imparted by institutions that reward certain inferences and ignore others. Drives guide attention, determine which facts count, and supply the tone of evaluation. Language stabilizes these selections into apparently self-evident categories. Institutions amplify them through pedagogy and practice. Perspectivism functions by staging conflicts of interpretation and learning from their friction. When outlooks clash, each exposes the blind spots of the other. Consider clinical practice for chronic pain. A neurologist emphasizes nerve signaling, a physiotherapist movement patterns, a psychologist cognitive appraisal. Coordinated comparison yields a more comprehensive treatment plan. The gain is not consensus for its own sake, but increased explanatory and practical power. In contemporary life, Perspectivism clarifies why complex problems resist single metric solutions and shows how plural inquiry improves judgment. In international water negotiations, hydrologists model flows, trade lawyers parse treaty obligations, and indigenous communities articulate long-standing stewardship norms. Agreements become durable when crafted through these heterogeneous lenses. In journalism, a city protest looks different through police incident logs, local business accounts, community elders' testimony, and court records. Responsible reporting triangulates rather than absolutizes any one source. In technology governance, content moderation teams pair linguistic expertise with legal standards and cultural knowledge to avoid parochial rules masquerading as universals. Perspectivism thus cultivates critical thinking, intercultural understanding, and institutional designs that learn rather than polarize. Integratively, Perspectivism prevents the slide from the death of absolutes into cynical indifference by offering criteria for ranking interpretations. Vitality, integrative reach, and resilience under challenge. It aligns with the will to power not as crude domination, but as the creative refinement of interpretive strength, and it reframes moral conflict, earlier analyzed through master-slave dynamics, as a contest of outlooks that can be genealogically examined and experimentally improved. Objectivity becomes a many-eyed discipline that trains capacities to take, test, and transcend standpoints. Such training prepares the ground for more demanding ideals of self-overcoming that will arise later in Nietzsche's thought. The Übermensch stands as Nietzsche's most demanding image of human possibility, a figure of self-overcoming who does not merely inherit morality, but generates values adequate to a world after the collapse of unquestioned authority. Emerging from the confrontation with nihilism and the critique of herd morality, this ideal concentrates the energy of the will to power into creation rather than conformity. It marks a pivot from diagnosing cultural decay to prescribing a path of growth where the individual becomes answerable for the principles by which life is judged. The stakes are exacting. Either ascend to creative legislation or remain governed by stale valuations. The Übermensch is not a biological type or a political program. It is a normative existential ideal of value creation. Nietzsche's framework rejects fixed moral universals and instead tasks the strongest spirits with a transvaluation of values. Replacing reactive standards born from ressentiment with life-affirming criteria that organize the drives into a higher rank order. Self-legislation names this capacity to give oneself law without appealing to external absolutes, while maintaining an intellectual conscience that forbids self-deception. The figure embodies affirmative strength, the power to say yes to existence in its difficulty, converting suffering into discipline and discipline into style. What makes this ideal distinctive is its insistence that creativity and responsibility grow together. Operationally, self-overcoming proceeds through diagnosis, discipline, and inventive reconfiguration. First, inherited valuations are examined for reactive origins, where guilt, envy, or fear set the rules. Second, drives are trained rather than repressed, so that ambition, aggression, or pride become sources of excellence rather than pathology. Third, a new hierarchy of ends is forged, tested by consistency, fecundity, and durability over time. In practice, this appears as rigorous experiment. A choreographer discards established scoring regimes and builds a movement language that better expresses vitality. A solo ocean sailor designs vessel, route, and risk protocols in line with a personal code that prizes mastery over spectacle. Contemporarily, the Übermensch illuminates projects that resist herd incentives while shouldering higher standards. A regenerative farmer redefines success from yield maximization to soil health and watershed resilience, accepting short-term losses for long-term flourishing. A fashion designer abandons seasonal churn to craft repairable, durable garments, educating patrons into care rather than novelty. A national arts fund shifts from engagement metrics to multi-year backing for difficult work, cultivating forms that outlast trends. An esports league rewrites rules to reward creative strategy over exploitative mechanics, even if audience numbers dip initially. In each case, value is not discovered but authored, then proven by endurance and generative effects. Understanding the Übermensch integrates earlier insights. Perspectivism maps the plurality of interpretations, while this ideal establishes a commanding center that orders them. The will to power becomes formative artistry rather than domination. The critique of slave morality clears space for affirmative rank. The result is not narcissistic license but heightened obligation. To craft a standard worthy of imitation and resilient under the harshest tests. This sets the stage for Nietzsche's next ordeal of evaluation, where one asks whether the life thus authored could be affirmed again and again without remainder, a criterion that completes the measure of genuine value creation. Eternal recurrence stands as Nietzsche's most exacting existential provocation, a demand that a life be affirmed so wholly that one would consent to live it again, identically, through infinite return. He forged this test within the broader struggle against nihilism, seeking a standard that exposes passive resignation and moralized self-deception. Rather than prescribing external duties, eternal recurrence intensifies responsibility by asking whether one's pattern of choices merits endless repetition. It reframes evaluation from abstract ideals to lived form, turning the entirety of a life into a single judgment. Can this be willed again without alteration or remainder? The stakes are maximal because the criterion is nothing less than unconditional affirmation. The thought experiment is structurally simple yet conceptually deep. Imagine a voice declaring that every event, decision, and consequence in one's life will recur in the same sequence innumerable times. Nietzsche sometimes toys with cosmological versions, but its philosophical core is normative and existential rather than physical. The test functions as a measure of affirmative strength, sorting lives oriented by resentment and avoidance from those capable of saying yes to time. It binds ethical weight to temporality. If nothing can be edited, does one still endorse the pattern? In relation to will to power and self-overcoming, eternal recurrence gauges whether one's values generate a durable orientation toward life, not merely episodic enthusiasm. It is, in effect, an assay of affirmation. Operationally, eternal recurrence works as a decision heuristic and a diagnostic of character formation. Applied to a choice, the agent asks, if this commitment returned endlessly, would it be desirable to live within its consequences again? The immediate affective response, aversion, indifference, or consent, reveals alignment between declared values and actual form of life. Over time, repeated use calibrates priorities. Habits that drain vitality are recognized and pruned. Relationships and projects that can be affirmed under repetition are deepened and stabilized. This mechanism resists short-term consolation because it treats every expedient as a precedent. A life becomes architected around choices that withstand recurrence, while those that fail the test lose legitimacy regardless of social approval. Contemporary application makes the test concrete. A mid-career physician choosing between a lucrative consultancy and opening a clinic in an underserved district assesses which path, if repeated unendingly, would remain worth endorsing given daily realities of care and constraint. A museum curator weighing a blockbuster exhibition against repatriation of contested artifacts evaluates which decision can be willed across infinite returns without concealed regret. A municipal emergency manager building earthquake preparedness, often invisible until catastrophe, chooses policies that under repetition protect dignity rather than merely optics. A parent considering reconciliation with an estranged sibling examines whether re-establishing steady, accountable contact is a pattern one could live again without bitterness. The test clarifies durable commitments amid transient incentives. Integratively, eternal recurrence operationalizes Nietzsche's anti-nihilist program by translating transvaluation into daily selection, aligning perspective, drive, and discipline. It complements Perspectivism by exposing which interpretations sustain affirmation over time, and it measures the strength envisioned in the Übermensch by requiring a form of life that can be endorsed without revision. Practiced steadily, it cultivates amor fati, active love of one's fate, because affirmation shifts from episodic pleasure to structural endorsement of one's trajectory. The result is a coherent orientation. Choices converge toward projects and relationships that are not merely survivable but worth repeating eternally, providing a stringent, luminous standard for life's worth. Transvaluation of values marks Nietzsche's most radical demand, the deliberate revaluation of inherited moral distinctions so that human flourishing is measured by life affirmation rather than conformity. Developed through his diagnosis of nihilism after the proclamation that God is dead and his critique of master-slave moralities, this project aims to replace reactive norms with creative standards aligned to strength, vitality, and responsibility. The intellectual stakes are exacting because the collapse of traditional absolutes leaves either resentful moralism or courageous value creation. Only the latter can avert cultural exhaustion and guide practices worthy of affirmation. This sets the stage for how transvaluation functions as a systematic ethical reorientation. At the theoretical level, transvaluation denotes a genealogical and perspectival reinterpretation of moral concepts, followed by constructive legislation of new rankings of good and bad. Genealogy exposes the contingent origins of virtues such as humility or pity when they harden into life-denying rules, while perspectivism clarifies that valuations are expressions of forms of life rather than mirrors of objective moral facts. The will to power supplies the criterion. Values are tested by whether they enhance the capacity to create, to promise, to bear responsibility, and to transfigure adversity. Thus, transvaluation is not mere negation. It is a normative reconfiguration that privileges excellence, self-overcoming, and the cultivation of higher types over herd preservation. The result is a rigorous framework for ethical innovation. Operationally, transvaluation advances through three linked mechanisms: critical unmasking, effective recalibration, and institutional reinscription. Critical unmasking tracks how rules arose through fear, envy, or administrative convenience so their authority can be reassessed. Effective recalibration then trains admiration toward courage, generosity, and creative severity rather than toward comfort or status signaling. Finally, institutional reinscription embeds the new priorities in language, metrics, and rituals. For example, a city transportation department shifting from throughput metrics to Vision Zero principles rewrites success as preventing deaths rather than speeding traffic. Likewise, a streaming platform that disables addictive autoplay in favor of mindful viewing reorients its product around stewardship of attention rather than extraction. Contemporary relevance emerges wherever inherited norms underperform. A district attorney's office building restorative justice diversion programs transvalues punishment by ranking accountability, repair, and future safety above spectacle and retribution. A privacy-first technology startup that refuses surveillance monetization converts the value hierarchy of growth at any cost into a standard that esteems user dignity and long-term trust. In medical training, residency cultures that replace endurance as moral proof with evidence-based schedules and reflective supervision elevate learning quality and patient outcomes over heroic depletion. These cases illustrate that transvaluation is concrete. It changes who is admired, what success measures count, and which practices are rewarded. Cultural tone follows those choices. Understanding transvaluation integrates earlier Nietzschean insights. Perspectivism prevents dogmatism in new standards. The will to power supplies a criterion of life enhancement. The Übermensch names the figure who legislates values. An eternal recurrence tests whether the revalued life is affirmable without remainder. The payoff is a disciplined creativity, able to move beyond reactive inversions toward durable, life-strengthening orders. This orientation prepares further inquiry into how cultures sustain higher forms without reverting to moralism, and how individuals craft practices that continually merit reaffirmation in changing conditions. Nietzsche's influence on existentialism and modern thought is foundational. His demolition of metaphysical guarantees and critique of inherited morality created the intellectual conditions for philosophies of authenticity, freedom, and responsibility. By exposing the fragility of universal truths and the genealogy of values, he compelled later thinkers to confront meaning-making as a human task rather than a cosmic inheritance. This legacy does not merely echo historically. It continues as a living challenge to contemporary culture's demand for certainty. The stakes are high. Whether human beings can affirm life in a disenchanted age and take ownership of value creation without recourse to transcendent authorities. That demand frames the modern existential project. The existentialist framework draws on Nietzsche's central moves while reconfiguring them into distinctive vocabularies. Heidegger's resoluteness and being toward death, Sartre's freedom and bad faith, Camus's absurd, Jaspers's boundary situations, and de Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity all work within a world where meaning is not given but made. What makes Nietzsche decisive is the prior eviction of absolutes, his perspectivism and genealogical method, so that authenticity means self-authorship rather than conformity to eternal forms. In modern thought beyond existentialism, Foucault's analysis of subject formation, Deleuze's creativity of difference, and critical engagements with power trace their possibility to Nietzsche's insistence that knowledge, morality, and identity are historically produced and thus transformable. Influence here functions as enabling conditions rather than prescriptive doctrine. Operationally, Nietzsche's impact works through three interlocking mechanisms. First, genealogical critique. By reconstructing the contingent origins of moral ideals, it loosens their claim to necessity and opens evaluative space. Second, practical experimentation. Perspectivism invites disciplined trials of living, comparing forms of life by their capacity to enhance strength, lucidity, and creative vitality. Third, demanding affirmation. The thought of eternal recurrence functions as a decision test, pressing agents to choose in ways that could be affirmed again and again. Consider a research community confronting a replication crisis. Genealogical scrutiny of incentives, experimental redesign of methods, and commitment to practices that could be affirmed repeatedly together enact a Nietzschean rhythm of critique, creation, and validation. The same pattern scales from individuals to institutions. Contemporary applications are concrete. In end-of-life care, families and clinicians must craft values, dignity, presence, analgesia, truthfulness, without recourse to a single sovereign rule. Responsibility is unavoidable, and authenticity is measured by the coherence of choices with the life actually lived. In the arts, musicians bypass algorithmic platforms, accept smaller audiences, and set self-imposed standards to preserve integrity over metrics, embodying value creation under conditions of indifference. In constitutional adjudication, courts interpret open-textured rights amid plural commitments, acknowledging that precedents are human posits requiring ongoing justification. In bioethics, CRISPR deliberations articulate principles, risk, consent, justice, without metaphysical guarantees, illustrating freedom joined to accountability. Each case operationalizes critique, invention, and affirmation. Integratively, existentialism inherits Nietzsche's entire arc. Apollonian Dionysian tension frames the arts of self-formation. Will to power supplies an interpretive lens for agency. Master-slave morality clarifies how ressentiment distorts value. Perspectivism disciplines inquiry. The Übermensch names aspirational self-legislation. Eternal recurrence intensifies evaluation, and transvaluation sets the program for institutional redesign. Understanding this lineage reframes modern crises not as deficits to be mourned, but as tasks requiring courage, subtlety, and creative rigor. The enduring implication is precise. Meaning becomes a practice, historically aware, experimentally sustained, and answerable to life's enhancement, rather than a doctrine to be received. The synthesis of Nietzsche's philosophy is a demanding architecture of thought that binds critique and creation into a single task. Human beings must become the authors of the values by which they live. Developed across his mature writings, this synthesis unites the will to power, the exposure of master-slave morality, perspectivism, the figure of the Übermensch, and the challenge of eternal recurrence into a coherent program of life construction. Its intellectual stakes are severe because it confronts nihilism not with consolation but with responsibility, urging a disciplined, affirmative revaluation of inherited norms in order to cultivate character, culture, and institutions capable of saying yes to existence. This closing integration makes explicit the pattern running through the whole project. At the level of framework, the synthesis can be mapped as a repeating sequence: diagnosis, critique, creation, testing, and embodiment. The death of God names the diagnostic crisis of meaning. Genealogy supplies the critical method for uncovering the origins and functions of moral judgments. Transvaluation institutes the constructive act of value invention. Eternal recurrence furnishes the maximal test of affirmation. The Übermensch serves as a regulative ideal of embodied excellence rather than a biological type. Perspectivism governs the epistemic posture of this sequence, clarifying that interpretation is inescapable and that ranking interpretations belongs to the work of valuation. The will to power operates throughout as the dynamic by which drives organize, interpret, and strive to enhance form and strength, while the Apollonian and Dionysian mark complementary energies requiring integration rather than victory. Operationally, the synthesis proceeds through disciplined ranking of drives, the conversion of suffering into strength, and systematic experiments in living that stabilize into forms without becoming rigid. Practices include self-assessment that detects reactive ressentiment, deliberate cultivation of demanding habits, and iterative prototyping of new norms in small circles before broader adoption. Conflict is treated as agon, structured contest oriented toward excellence, rather than moralized hostility. For example, a metropolitan public library retires late fees, then codifies a makerspace and language learning mission to re-anchor shared purpose. Membership norms, not penalties, secure commitment. Likewise, a patient-owned telemedicine cooperative formalizes standards for access and clinician feedback, transforming dependency into participatory authorship of care. Contemporarily, this synthesis clarifies how meaning can be constructed under pluralism without collapsing into relativism or returning to dogma. A secondary school ethics program shifts from rule memorization to character formation. Students design personal honor codes, face public challenges to defend revisions, and adopt practices that must pass an all-year-again recurrence test. An AI research lab adopts an interpretability charter that outranks raw benchmark dominance, requiring models to meet explanation standards before deployment. Technical performance is subsumed under a higher value of intelligibility. A community-led language revitalization initiative uses narrative festivals, apprenticeships, and governance seats for elders to recenter linguistic flourishing as a civic good, not merely a heritage artifact. Comprehending the synthesis yields an integrated path. Confront nihilism lucidly, trace the lineage of one's morals, create and rank values that enhance life, affirm them under the thought of recurrence, and embody them in institutions and character. The payoff is not comfort but orientation, a stable method for renewing meaning without superstition or cynicism. It unites Dionysian vitality with Apollonian form, channels will to power into culture building, and treats the Übermensch as the horizon of ongoing self-overcoming. Such understanding equips persons and communities to move from critique to creation, sustaining a long yes that can organize an age.